There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the weight of a sleeping man on your chest. You can live an entire lifetime inside the seconds of a moment like that. You can trace its origins, map its future, and catalog every single sensation until it becomes more real than the room around you. For me, that moment was this one. Leo was asleep, a dead weight of trust and exhaustion pressed against my sternum, his breath a warm, rhythmic tide against my neck. The television was a murmur of forgotten dialogue in the corner, casting flickering blue ghosts across the ceiling of my small apartment. My own breath was a prisoner in my lungs, held captive by the fear that the slightest exhale might shatter the impossible peace of it all. This was the culmination of 1,000 silent negotiations, a destination I had only ever visited in the most audacious corners of my imagination, and now that I was here, I was terrified to move. His hand was curled loosely on my stomach, his fingers lax, and I could feel the faint, steady pulse in his wrist against my shirt. It was a second heartbeat, a metronome counting out the seconds of this borrowed time. I was a cartographer of his sleep, learning the geography of his stillness, the subtle shift of muscle as he sank deeper into a dream. And in the quiet, cavernous space of my own mind, I began to retrace the map of how we had arrived here, in this place where the line between friendship and something more had become so beautifully, terrifyingly blurred. It all began with a wall. That's the simple truth of it. A single partition of plaster and studs separating apartment 3A from apartment 3B. When I first moved in, the building superintendent, a man named Mr. Henderson who smelled perpetually of sawdust and peppermint, had warned me about it. Walls are thin in these old places, he'd said, tapping a knuckle against the surface that would become the primary feature of my living room. You'll hear your neighbor breathe. You will? I'd smiled and nodded, thinking it was an exaggeration. I was a photographer, a creature of quiet observation. I craved solitude not as an absence of people, but as an absence of noise, a blank canvas on which the world could paint its details from my lens. A little bit of shared sound seemed a small price to pay for the magnificent northern light that flooded the apartment every afternoon. I had no idea then that the wall was not a barrier but a membrane, a semi-permeable boundary through which a life would seep into my own. My neighbor, the source of the breathing I was promised, was Leo. I met him the day I moved in. He appeared in my doorway as I was wrestling with a box of books that seemed to have been packed with lead weights. He was all energy and bright, easy smiles, dressed in running shorts and a faded university sweatshirt. He was taller than me, with a runner's lean frame and a cascade of unruly dark hair that he constantly had to push out of his eyes. He didn't ask if I needed help. He simply took one end of the box, his knuckles brushing mine for a fleeting, electric second. I'm Leo, he'd said, grunting with the effort. 3B, the guy you'll be hearing argue with the television during football season. His voice was a warm, rumbling baritone that seemed to fill the space, a stark contrast to my own quieter frequency. I remember thinking, in that first encounter, that he was like a sun-drenched room, and I was the cool, shaded corner. I was Julian, I told him, and my voice sounded thin and reedy next to his. He just smiled, a brilliant flash of white, and said, "Welcome to the third floor, Julian. It's better up here." Our friendship was built in the small, interstitial moments of apartment living. It was him knocking on my door to borrow a cup of sugar, and then staying for an hour, perched on my kitchen counter, telling me about the software he was designing for a client in Chicago. It was me, smelling the pizza he'd ordered after a long day, and him wordlessly handing me a slice over the threshold of his open door. We discovered a shared love for old vinyl, for overpriced takeout, for the specific, melancholy beauty of the city at dusk. He was an extrovert, a collector of people and experiences, his life a whirlwind of travel for his consulting job. He would disappear for weeks at a time, and his apartment would fall silent, a hollow space next to mine. The quiet I normally craved felt different then. It wasn't peaceful, it was empty. Then he would return, and the life would rush back into the building. I'd hear his keys in the lock, The thud of his suitcase, the rush of the shower, and a strange sense of equilibrium would settle back over me. He was the constant, chaotic noise to my structured silence, and I found, to my own surprise, that I was beginning to need his frequency to feel properly tuned. I fell for him in increments, the way a photograph develops in the darkroom. It wasn't a sudden flash of light, but a slow, creeping emergence of an image that had been there all along, latent and invisible. It was in the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he laughed, a genuine, unself-conscious expression of joy that made my chest ache. It was in the thoughtful way he'd listen, really listen, when I'd try to explain the complex, abstract feeling I was trying to capture in a series of photographs. He didn't always understand the technical aspects of aperture or film grain, but he understood the emotion. So, you're trying to catch what loneliness feels like when it's not sad, just quiet, he'd say, and he would be so precisely right that it would steal my breath. He saw the heart of my work, and in doing so, he felt dangerously close to seeing the heart of me. I began to guard myself, to build fortifications. The friendship was too valuable, a rare and precious ecosystem. My feelings were an invasive species, something that could choke the life out of everything if I let them take root. So I became an expert in redirection, in platonic warmth, in the careful maintenance of a boundary he didn't even know existed. I would photograph him in my mind 100 times a day, Leo leaning against the doorframe, bathed in the hallway's amber light. Leo concentrating, a pen tucked behind his ear. Leo's silhouette on the fire escape we sometimes shared. The city lights a scattered galaxy behind him. I collected these images, stored them in the locked archive of my heart, and told myself it was enough. The shift came on a rainy Tuesday in October. It was the kind of relentless, soul-dampening rain that makes the entire city feel like it's sighing. Leo had been seeing a woman named Clara for about a year. She was an architect who lived in Boston, and their relationship existed mostly in weekend trips and late-night video calls. I knew her only as a voice through the wall, a cheerful, melodious sound that often mingled with Leo's deeper laughter. I had constructed an elaborate, painful piece with her existence. She was a part of his world, a world I was adjacent to but not truly in. She kept him happy, and his happiness was, I had convinced myself, my primary concern. That night, the voices through the wall were different. They weren't laughing. The tones were low, clipped, punctuated by long, heavy silences that felt louder than any argument. I turned up the music on my stereo, a feeble attempt to grant them a privacy that the architect of our building had not. After an hour, there was only one voice, Leo's, saying something short and final, and then a profound, aching silence. The silence of a line gone dead. An hour later, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't Leo's usual confident rap. It was a hesitant, almost timid tapping. I opened it to find him standing there, drenched from a walk he must have taken in the downpour. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his clothes were soaked through, but it was his eyes that held me. The usual light in them was gone, replaced by a hollow, exhausted vacancy. He looked like a traveler who had finally reached the end of a long, punishing road only to find that his destination had vanished. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, a silent plea in his gaze. Some unspoken rule of our carefully constructed friendship dissolved in that moment. I stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He walked past me, dripping onto the hardwood floor, and sank onto my couch as if his legs could no longer support him. He dropped his head into his hands, and the only sound was the dripping of water from his jacket onto the floor and the quiet, shuddering breaths he tried to conceal. I didn't ask what was wrong. I didn't need to. I just went to my closet, grabbed the thickest, softest blanket I owned, and draped it over his shoulders. He didn't look up, but his hand came up to clutch the edge of the fabric. It was the first crack in his armor I had ever seen, the first time the unknowing initiator had come to my door not to give, but to take comfort. And I, the quiet observer, found myself in the terrifying, privileged position of having it to give. That night was the beginning of the ritual. After he had sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice muffled by his hands. It's over. With Clara, it was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the flat effect of someone reporting distant news. He explained, in clipped, weary sentences, that it had been coming for a long time. The distance, the different life trajectories, the slow erosion of connection. It wasn't a tragedy, he kept saying, it was just an ending. But his posture, the deep-set exhaustion in his face, told a different story. It was the story of an anchor being pulled up, leaving him adrift. I made him tea, the kind with chamomile and lavender that I drank when my thoughts were too loud. He held the mug in both hands, letting the steam warm his face, and we sat in a comfortable, shared silence. He didn't cry. He just seemed to deflate, all the bright, kinetic energy that defined him draining away, leaving something fragile and quiet in its place. Eventually, he looked over at me, his eyes shadowed with a profound loneliness. Can I just stay here for a bit? On the couch? My place feels too loud. The irony was thick enough to taste. His apartment was utterly silent, yet it was screaming at him. Mine, with me in it, was the quiet he needed. I simply nodded. Stay as long as you want, he gave me a small, grateful smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. And then he curled up on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around himself, and fell asleep almost instantly, like a man who hadn't rested in years. I stayed up late, working in my darkroom, the faint red light a sanctuary. I could hear his soft breathing from the other room, and I felt a tectonic shift happening in the landscape of our friendship. The ground was unsteady beneath my feet, and I didn't know if it was the prelude to an earthquake or the settling of new, more solid land. From that night on, my apartment became his harbor. His work travel seemed to intensify, as if he were trying to outrun the stillness of his own life. He would come home from Denver or San Francisco, haggard and jet-lagged, and his first stop would be my door. The pretext started out plausible. Hey, my internet is down. Can I use yours to send this one last email? Or, I forgot to get groceries. You have anything I can eat? But soon, the pretexts faded away, replaced by a simple, unspoken understanding. My door was unlocked. He would let himself in, his voice a soft question in the quiet. Jules. And I would answer from my desk or the kitchen. In here, the relief in his posture upon finding me there was palpable. It was as if my presence confirmed that a fixed point in his spinning world still existed. The couch became our territory. It started with him just sitting at the far end while I worked, the two of us coexisting in a shared bubble of silence. Then came the movie nights. Let's watch something stupid, he'd say, and we would. He'd start on his side of the couch, and I on mine. But as the movie wore on and his exhaustion took over, the space between us would shrink. The first time he leaned against me, I swear my heart stopped. His head just tilted, slowly, inevitably, until it came to rest on my shoulder. He was asleep within minutes. I sat there, rigid, a statue carved from anxiety and a desperate, soaring hope. I could feel the texture of his hair against my cheek. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo mixed with the sterile smell of airplane air. I analyzed the weight of him, the warmth seeping through my shirt, searching for meaning. Was this just the path of least resistance for a tired body? A platonic gesture of comfort between friends? Or was it the subconscious expression of something deeper, a magnetic pull he wasn't even aware of? I was a scientist studying a new, unclassifiable phenomenon. I recorded the data, the pressure, the temperature, the duration, but I couldn't form a hypothesis without risking the entire experiment. To move, to speak, to even breathe too deeply felt like it would spook him, like he would wake up and realize the boundary he had crossed and retreat back to the safety of his own apartment, and the ritual would be over forever. So I stayed still. I let my arm fall asleep. I let the movie end and the screen go black. I waited until his breathing was deep and even, and only then did I allow myself the smallest luxury of relaxing, of leaning my own head gently against his. This became the new shape of our evenings. The ritual evolved, slowly and organically. The shoulder lean graduated to him stretching out, his head finding its way into my lap as I read or edited photos on my laptop. He would murmur something about my couch being uncomfortable any other way, a flimsy excuse we both tacitly agreed to accept. I would rest my hand on his back, a gesture I told myself was meant to be steadying, reassuring. But my fingers would tingle with the charge of it, with the profound intimacy of feeling the rise and fall of his breathing under my palm. We bought a bigger, softer blanket, a joint purchase that felt like a quiet commitment. On cold nights, we'd cocoon ourselves in it, our legs tangled together, the heat from our bodies creating a warm, safe cave against the world. He talked more during these times, not about Clara, but about the gnawing loneliness of hotel rooms, the disorienting feeling of waking up and not knowing what city he was in. He talked about the pressure of his job, the constant need to be on, to be the charming, confident consultant. In my apartment, on my couch, he could finally be off, he could be quiet and tired and vulnerable. And he had chosen me to be the guardian of that vulnerability. The anxiety was a constant hum beneath the surface of my joy. I lived in a state of hyper-awareness, cataloging every touch, every shared glance, every soft sigh. I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was also the primary suspect, terrified that my own feelings were coloring the evidence. Did he hold my gaze for a second too long? Did his hand, when it brushed mine, linger? Or was I just projecting my own desperate yearning onto the blank canvas of his exhaustion? I felt like I was walking a tightrope over a canyon. On one side was the safe, solid ground of our friendship. On the other was something else, a territory I couldn't name but longed for with every fiber of my being. The tightrope was our shared couch, the blanket, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Every night we spent like this, I walked that rope, terrified of falling, yet unwilling to turn back. I was trapped in the beautiful, agonizing space of the unspoken. He had built a nest of comfort in my life, and I didn't dare disturb it for fear he would realize it was built in the branches of a tree that was already in love with him. The wall between our apartments was no longer a physical barrier. The wall was now inside me, a partition between what I felt and what I was allowed to show. And through that wall, I could hear his sleeping breath, a sound that was both a comfort and a torment. The night of the crossing was different. It had a strange, charged quality from the moment he arrived. He'd just returned from a 2-week trip to London that had clearly taken its toll. The shadows under his eyes were darker, his movements slower, as if he were moving through water. He didn't even offer a pretext this time. He just walked in, dropped his bag by the door, and came straight to the couch where I was sketching in my notebook. He collapsed beside me, not even leaving the customary few inches of space. He just folded into my side, tucking his head into the space between my shoulder and my neck, and let out a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire trip. "Long one?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He just hummed in response, a low, weary vibration against my collarbone. We stayed like that for a long time, the silence broken only by the scratch of my pencil on the page and the distant wail of a siren. I could feel the tension slowly leaving his body, the tight knot of stress in his shoulders beginning to unwind. My own body, however, was a string pulled taut. His proximity was overwhelming, a sensory overload of warmth and scent and presence that short-circuited my brain. Eventually, I put my sketchbook aside. The pretense of doing anything else was impossible. We were just there, existing in that space, wrapped in the familiar blanket. The city lights painted soft patterns on the wall. I thought he was asleep. His breathing was even, his body still. I was caught in my usual internal debate, the familiar cycle of hope and fear, when his voice, quiet and surprisingly awake, cut through the silence. "Jules." My heart hammered against my ribs. It was the same way he always said my name, but this time it held a different timbre. It wasn't a question seeking a location, it was a question seeking something else. "Yeah." I managed my own voice tight. He shifted, lifting his head just enough to look at me. His eyes, in the dim light, were dark and deep and impossibly close. The playful energy was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded seriousness I had never seen before. "Can I ask you something stupid?" he whispered. The air crackled. This was new terrain. A small, wry smile touched my lips, a reflex of nervousness. "Always," I whispered back. He hesitated, his gaze dropping for a second to my mouth before returning to my eyes. He made a small, vague gesture to the way we were tangled together on the couch. "Is this okay?" The question was so simple, so direct, and yet it held the weight of worlds. He was asking for confirmation. He was acknowledging that this, whatever this was, existed. The plausible deniability of his exhaustion was gone. He was awake. He was aware. And he was asking. The tightrope beneath me swayed. This was the moment. The choice. I could retreat to safety, laugh it off, say of course, we're friends, or I could take a step forward into the terrifying, beautiful unknown. My own answer was just as quiet, but it felt like a shout. Yes. A beat of silence passed. It was a loaded, transformative silence. I could see a universe of calculations happening behind his eyes. He had asked, and I had answered. The next move was his. He took a slow breath, and the scent of the city reigned and his skin filled my senses. Then, he spoke again, his voice even lower, so low I almost felt it more than heard it. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The sirens outside, the hum of the refrigerator, the frantic drumming of my own heart. It all faded into a distant hum. There was only his question hanging in the space between us. It was the most terrifying and beautiful question I had ever heard. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a confident move. It was a plea for permission. It was an admission of vulnerability that mirrored my own. He was standing on his side of the canyon, asking if it was safe to cross. In that moment, all my fear, all my carefully constructed walls, all my anxieties about ruining our friendship, they all felt secondary to the profound, overwhelming truth of the moment. He was asking. He was choosing this. My voice was gone, trapped somewhere in my throat, so I just nodded. A small, jerky movement, but it was enough. He searched my eyes for another second, as if looking for any sign of doubt, and then he leaned in. The kiss was nothing like I had imagined in my countless, secret daydreams. It wasn't passionate or demanding. It was tentative, hesitant. It was a soft, searching pressure of his lips against mine. It was a question, an exploration, a confession. It tasted of tea and salt and a deep, soul-shaking relief. I felt his hand come up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, and the simple, gentle touch was more earth-shattering than the kiss itself. I brought my own hand up to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic, galloping beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was racing just as fast as mine. I was not alone on the tightrope. He was here with me. The kiss ended as gently as it began. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead coming to rest against mine. His eyes were closed. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence was no longer empty or anxious. It was full. It was overflowing with everything we had left unsaid for months. In the quiet of my living room, with the city lights painting ghosts on the wall, a boundary had been crossed, a new language had been learned, and the entire architecture of my world had been redrawn. We had built something new in the beautiful, honest silence. The immediate aftermath was a dreamlike state of tender suspension. We didn't talk about what had happened. The kiss was a silent, sacred object we had placed in the center of the room, too fragile to be touched by words just yet. We simply drifted. He settled back against me, his head in its familiar place on my shoulder, but everything was different. His hand found mine, and his fingers laced with my own, a simple, declarative act that sent a shock-wave of warmth through my entire body. It wasn't the accidental brush of a sleeping man. It was a conscious, deliberate connection. We fell asleep like that, tangled in the blanket, hands intertwined, two halves of a puzzle that had finally clicked into place. For the first time, there was no anxiety humming beneath my skin, no fear of the morning. There was only a profound, bone-deep peace. It felt like coming home after a long, weary journey. I fell asleep believing we had finally arrived. I was wrong. When I woke up, the morning light was streaming through the windows, painting dust motes in golden shafts. The apartment was silent. The space beside me on the couch was empty, and the air was cold where his body had been. For a confused second, I thought I might have dreamt it all, a vivid, desperate hallucination born of loneliness and longing. But then I saw it. On the small table next to the couch, propped against a stack of photography books, was a folded piece of paper. My heart sank. It was a page torn from my own sketchbook. His handwriting, a familiar, messy scrawl, was a stark black line against the white paper. Had to catch an early flight. Talk later. L. That was it. No mention of the kiss. No acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had occurred between us. Just a clumsy, logistical note. Talk later. The words were a hollow promise. I sank back into the couch cushions, the phantom weight of him still an impression in the fabric. The beautiful, fragile object we had created was gone, and in its place was this cold, impersonal note. The peace I had felt was replaced by a creeping, icy dread. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss hadn't been a beginning. It had been a moment of weakness for him, a temporary lapse in judgment fueled by exhaustion and loneliness, a mistake he was now running from. He had taken his comfort and fled, leaving me to deal with the wreckage. The photographer in me saw the image with brutal clarity. I had exposed the film to the light too soon, and now all I had was a bleached, overexposed sheet, the ghost of an image haunting its blankness. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Later never came. He didn't call. He didn't text. His trip was supposed to last 4 days, and I counted the hours. The silence from apartment 3B was absolute. The wall, which had once been a conduit for his life, was now a tombstone. I would stand with my hand flat against it, trying to feel some vibration, some sign of his existence, but there was nothing. I tortured myself by replaying the kiss over and over in my mind, dissecting it from every angle. I had been so sure of the look in his eyes, of the frantic beat of his heart. Had I invented it all? Had my own desperate hope projected a meaning that was never there? The tightrope I had been walking had snapped, and I was in freefall, the canyon floor of our simple, easy friendship rushing up to meet me. The hurt was a physical thing, a dull, constant ache in my chest. But underneath the hurt was a growing current of anger. Anger at him for his cowardice, for leaving me in this agonizing limbo. And anger at myself for being so naive, for letting my guard down, for daring to believe that I could have something so good. He came back on a Thursday night. I heard his key in the lock, the familiar thud of his suitcase. My entire body went rigid. I waited, my breath held, for the sound of his footsteps in the hall, for the soft knock on my door, for the tentative jewels that had become the soundtrack to my life. But it never came. I heard the water run for his shower. I heard the low murmur of his television. He was there. He was just feet away, on the other side of the wall, and he was choosing to stay there. He was erasing me. He was pretending the kiss, the couch, the blanket, the past several months had never happened. That was what broke me. It wasn't the silence while he was away. It was the silence now that he was back. It was an active, intentional silence. It was a choice, and I couldn't live inside it for one more second. My knuckles were white as I gripped the doorknob to my own apartment. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I had no plan. I had no idea what I was going to say. I just knew that the ambiguous silence was a poison, and I had to get it out of my system, one way or another. I crossed the small landing in 3 strides and knocked on his door. The sound was loud and sharp in the quiet hallway, a stark contrast to the hesitant tap he had given my door weeks ago. I heard the television click off. Silence. Then footsteps. The lock turned with a heavy, final-sounding clunk. The door opened a few inches. He stood there, backlit by the light from his living room. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on a spot on the floor somewhere to my left. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still damp from the shower. He looked tired, yes, but more than that, he looked cornered. "Hey," he said, his voice low and rough. "Hey," I replied, my own voice surprisingly steady. I waited for him to say more, to invite me in, to offer any kind of explanation. He did none of those things. He just stood there, a human wall, blocking the entrance to his life. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The anger and the hurt coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. "Talk to me, Leo," I said, the words quiet but unyielding. "Please, don't do this. Don't just disappear." The silence is worse than anything you could possibly say. His eyes finally flickered up to meet mine, and what I saw there wasn't indifference. It was fear, a deep, profound, panicked fear. His jaw tightened. "Jules, he started, then stopped, shaking his head. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. That night was a mistake." The word mistake hit me like a physical blow. It was the confirmation of my worst fears. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had come here for honesty, and here it was, in all its brutal, devastating simplicity. I wanted to turn and walk away, to retreat back into my apartment and bolt the door, to rebuild my fortifications stronger and higher than ever before. But his fear held me in place. It was too raw, too real. It didn't align with the simple narrative of a man regretting a drunken, meaningless kiss. This was something else. I took a breath, anchoring myself. "A mistake for who, Leo?" I asked, my voice still quiet. "For you? Or for me?" He flinched, as if my words had struck him. He ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture of pure distress. "I don't know," he finally whispered, the sound raw and broken. "I don't know. I freaked out." He finally looked at me, truly looked at me, and his carefully constructed composure crumbled. It's all I could think about the entire trip. The you. Us. On the couch. And it felt right, Jules. It felt more right than anything has in a very, very long time. And that scared the hell out of me. He finally opened the door wider, a gesture of surrender. "Come in." I stepped inside his apartment. It was the mirror image of my own, but it felt completely different. It was sparse, transient. There were no photos on the walls, no personal touches. It looked like a hotel room, a place where someone lived but did not reside. We stood in the middle of his living room, the space between us charged with a fragile, volatile energy. He wouldn't look at me, instead pacing a short, agitated line in front of his own couch, a piece of furniture that looked stiff and uninviting. "I've never," he started, his voice cracking. He stopped pacing and faced me, his expression one of desperate, painful confusion. "I've never felt that for a guy before, Julian. I don't know what it means. All I know is that my best friend, the most important person in my life, suddenly felt like more." And I panicked. I thought if I put distance between us, if I pretended it didn't happen, it would just go away. That we could go back to how we were. He let out a humorless, choked laugh. "But we can't, can we?" I broke it. His confession hung in the air, a torrent of fear and confusion and a startling, terrifying honesty. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself. He hadn't been erasing the kiss because it meant nothing. He had been erasing it because it meant everything. The anger that had propelled me across the hall evaporated, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He looked so lost, so utterly adrift in his own feelings. He was the unknowing initiator, and he had finally stumbled into a room he didn't know existed, and the door had locked behind him. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "I'm sorry, Jules. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I was just so scared." I closed the distance between us. I didn't think about it. My body just moved. I reached out and placed my hands on his shoulders, forcing him to be still, to look at me. His entire body was trembling. "You didn't break it, Leo," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "You were just honest. For a second. And then you got scared. I get it. I've been scared for months." His eyes widened, the confusion momentarily replaced by surprise. "Months," he whispered. I gave a small, sad smile. "You think I let just anyone fall asleep in my lap?" The ghost of his own smile flickered across his lips. The tension in his shoulders eased a fraction. "I'm an idiot," he breathed. "No," I said, my thumbs stroking the tense muscle of his shoulders. "You're human, and you're my friend. Before anything else, you're my friend. So we'll figure it out." Together, the fear in his eyes didn't vanish, but it was joined by something else. Gratitude, and a fragile, dawning hope. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against mine, just as he had after the kiss. This time, it wasn't an act of tentative discovery, but one of profound, exhausted relief. It was a homecoming. That night, we talked. We really talked. Not on a couch, not under the guise of a movie, but sitting across from each other at his stark kitchen table, the harsh overhead light leaving no room for shadows or ambiguity. We laid our feelings out on the table like a collection of fragile, priceless artifacts. I told him everything. I told him about the first day I met him, the feeling of his energy filling my quiet space. I told him about the ache in my chest when he would laugh, about the mental photographs I'd taken of him 1,000 times. I confessed that my carefully guarded friendship was a fortress built to contain a love I was terrified would destroy it. I admitted that every time he'd fallen asleep on my couch, it had been both a gift and a torment. I laid bare the months of my silent yearning, the tightrope walk of my emotions. I expected him to be overwhelmed, to pull back, but he just listened, his eyes never leaving my face, his expression a mixture of awe and a dawning, painful understanding. When I was finished, the silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of absorption, of processing. Then, he began to speak. He told me about the crushing loneliness of his job, the feeling of being a perpetual guest in his own life. He said Clara had been his anchor, but their connection had been fraying for a long time, becoming more of a habit than a harbor. When it ended, he was truly adrift. And then there was your apartment, he said, his voice soft with wonder. Your light was always on. It was quiet. It was solid. Being in your space, with you, was the only time I felt like I could breathe, like I could stop performing. He explained that the physical closeness hadn't been a conscious decision at first. It was an instinct, like a cold man seeking a fire. He was seeking warmth, stillness, safety. He was seeking me. I just kept getting closer, he said, a look of self-discovery on his face. I didn't even know why. It just felt necessary. Like I was starving and you were the only person with food. He finally looked down at his hands, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. And then that night, I wasn't tired anymore. I was just looking at you, and all I could think was that I didn't want to be anywhere else. Kissing you felt like the most natural, logical thing in the world. It felt like an answer to a question I didn't even know I'd been asking. His honesty was a balm on the wound his silence had created. All the hurt, all the insecurity, it all washed away, replaced by a simple, profound understanding. We weren't a mistake. We were an inevitability, a slow, gravitational pull that had finally brought us together. We talked until the sky outside began to lighten from black to a deep, bruised purple. We dismantled the wall of unspoken things brick by brick, until there was nothing left between us but the raw, vulnerable truth. When there were no more words to say, a new, peaceful quiet settled over us. He looked exhausted, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. It was the good, clean fatigue that comes after a long, arduous journey is finally over. Can we go to your place? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I don't want to be here tonight. I understood. His apartment was the site of his loneliness, his confusion. Mine was where he had found his comfort. It was our space. I just nodded, and for the first time, we left his apartment and crossed the landing together. We didn't go to the couch. I led him to my bedroom, a room he had only ever glimpsed from the hallway. It was as quiet and simple as the rest of my apartment, dominated by a large window and a bed piled with soft blankets. We crawled under the covers, the cool sheets a shock against our skin. We lay on our sides, facing each other, the space between us humming with a new, gentle energy. There was no desperate need, no passionate fire. There was just a quiet, certain rightness. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw, his touch no longer hesitant, but full of a soft, wondering reverence. All this time, he whispered, more to himself than to me. You were right here. I covered his hand with my own, pressing his palm to my cheek. I wasn't going anywhere, I said. And in the soft gray light of dawn, we fell asleep, not with the frantic relief of a kiss or the exhaustion of a confession, but with the deep, quiet peace of two people who had finally found their way home. The days that followed were a study in gentle recalibration. Our new reality wasn't announced with a fanfare. It arrived quietly, in small, domestic moments that were more profound than any grand declaration. The couch ritual continued, but its meaning had transformed. There was no more anxiety, no more analysis. His head in my lap was no longer a question mark, but a statement. It was a simple, lovely fact of our evenings. The door between our apartments remained, but the one between our lives had dissolved. My door was no longer left unlocked in hope. It was simply unlocked because he belonged on both sides of it. He started leaving things at my place, a toothbrush next to mine, a comfortable sweatshirt draped over a chair, his running shoes by the door. Each item was a small, quiet anchor, mooring his life more firmly to mine. One Saturday, I was in my darkroom, the intimate red light bathing everything in a warm, secret glow. I was developing photos from a series I'd started on urban solitude, but the theme felt distant now, a relic from a former life. I heard the darkroom door creak open, a sliver of hallway light cutting through the red. "Jules." Leo's voice was a soft intrusion. "Sorry, am I interrupting?" I smiled in the darkness. "It's fine. Come in," but closed the door quickly. He slipped inside, plunging us back into the monochromatic world. He stood beside me, his presence a familiar warmth. "Wow," he breathed, looking at the images hanging from a line, ghostly negatives slowly coming to life in the chemical bath. "So this is where the magic happens." I took a blank sheet of photographic paper and placed it under the enlarger, a negative of a rain-slicked street positioned above it. "Want to see?" I asked. He leaned closer, his arm brushing against mine. I flipped the switch, and for a few seconds, a bright light projected the image onto the paper. Then, darkness again. I slipped the seemingly blank sheet into the tray of developer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a ghost emerging from the mist, the image began to appear. The dark lines of the buildings, the bright reflections on the wet pavement, the solitary figure walking under an umbrella. Leo let out a soft, amazed sound. "How do you do that?" he whispered. "It's a process," I said, gently rocking the tray. "You have to be patient. You have to trust what's latent in the paper, what you can't see yet. Too much light, too much agitation, and you ruin it. But if you give it time, in the right conditions, it shows you what was there all along." I glanced at him. In the deep red light, his eyes were fixed on my face, and his expression was one of profound, dawning comprehension. He wasn't just looking at the photograph. He was looking at us. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine in the cool, chemical-scented air. He didn't say anything, but in that moment, in the quiet sanctuary of my darkroom, the metaphor settled over us, a perfect, unspoken truth. We were a slow development, an image that had required darkness and patience and trust to finally emerge. We never put a label on it. We didn't need to. We were Julian and Leo. We were 3A and 3B. We were the man who traveled the world and the man who waited for him to come home. Our language was not in words, but in the making of morning coffee, in the shared space on a couch, in the quiet understanding that passed between us in a single glance. His apartment gradually became more of a storage unit, a place he kept his suits and his suitcase. His life, his rest, his home, that was all with me. The wall between our apartments was still there, a physical fact of the building, but it was now just a wall. It held no power. It was no longer a symbol of separation or a membrane for longing. It was just plaster and studs. The real frontier had been the one inside ourselves, the boundaries of fear and self-protection we had both been too scared to cross. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake next to him, listening to the steady, even rhythm of his breathing. I would think about that first night he'd fallen asleep on my chest, how I'd felt like a thief, stealing a moment of impossible intimacy. I was no longer that man. I was no longer just the quiet observer, cataloging feelings from a safe distance. I had stepped into the frame. I had risked the blur. His presence beside me was not borrowed time. It was just time. Our time. It turns out that a home is not four walls and a roof. Sometimes it's a person. It's the safe harbor of their presence, the quiet certainty of their hand in yours. It's the beautiful, honest silence you learn to create together, a silence that isn't empty, but full of everything you no longer need to say. The wall was where our story began, a symbol of the distance between us. But it was in tearing down the walls within ourselves that we finally found our way across the landing and into a shared and profoundly peaceful life. We had started as neighbors, sharing a wall. We had become two halves of the same quiet, happy home.